All right. Hello, friends. Bitcoin Frankie here, welcoming you to Crypto Internet. Now, while the host and the speakers gear up to kick off this conversation, I'm going to go ahead and make some brief introductions. Today's discussion is going to be centered around DeFi on Bitcoin. Muneeb, who you know as the co-founder of Stacks, and Patrick, CEO of Freehold, is joining a special guest, Edan Yago, who's the co-founder of Sovryn. Sovryn being the decentralized Bitcoin trading and lending platform, along with Ingamar, who works in partnerships and integrations at Sovryn. We will take your questions about 40 minutes into the discussion, so hang tight. We're going to make an announcement and then bring you up to the stage when the time is right. All right, let's get it started in a big way today by helping me welcome our hosts, Muneeb and Patrick.
Awesome, thanks so much. I feel like Patrick is sort of like traveling and not at the best location for signal and stuff, but really excited to have Yago here. Most people already probably know about Sovryn, but how about I'll let you guys kind of like, give a little bit more background, more on the personal side as well, but also about the project.
Sure, so from a background perspective, I grew up in apartheid South Africa. My family were associated with the apartheid groups, with the ANC and with others. Many of them were forced to flee South Africa. When I was a young boy, I had the surreal experience of becoming a gold smuggler because we needed to get money out to the people who had to flee, and so my mother bought Kruger rands, which were these gold coins produced by the South African government, and would sew them into my clothes and then send me flying alone to get them out of the country because they wouldn't search little kids. Between that and various other stories of my family having to deal with autocratic regimes, it became clear to me, even at a very young age, that the first thing that autocratic regimes go after is financial freedom and money. And we've seen that play out many, many times. And so I remained throughout my life politically active in one part of my life. And the other part of my life is I've always been very interested in how technology builds better futures. And really the only type of progress that we've ever seen has come through free markets and technological development. So I became a neuroscientist, started a few companies, and while I was working on one of them, I came across the Bitcoin white paper. Weirdly, I came across the Bitcoin white paper because I was researching other work that we were doing in network science, and I spilled my coffee all over my laptop. I was so shocked by the sudden realization that somebody had created a way for there to be digital property rights, digital scarcity, and a way for people to be able to transfer funds outside of the world of violence and borders. And I realized that if this succeeded, nobody would need to smuggle gold across any border ever again. And so that was back in 2011. I've been involved in Bitcoin pretty much ever since. And in previous efforts, I've been involved in setting up companies focused on remittance and integrating with financial institutions to do this. Those were the worst years of my life because I had to deal with banks and financial institutions all the time. And so a few years ago, I concluded that there was no way that we were going to achieve for Bitcoin what we wanted to achieve for Bitcoin if it was gated by the centralized players of the status quo. And some of my friends showed me some work that they had been doing, building a decentralized financial system based on Bitcoin, which would allow for Bitcoiners to finally get rid of all intermediaries, to get rid of banks, to get rid of exchanges, to get rid of fiat by having Bitcoin-backed stablecoins. That project was Sovryn, and I've been contributing to Sovryn ever since.
Awesome. I think I've heard your goldsmithing story once before as well. It's like such a, you can almost picture it, right? Like it's a very visual type of a story in my mind. And obviously, taking Bitcoin around is a lot easier. I think you were breaking up a little bit. I don't know if it was just for me.
No, I just asked if maybe Ingamar wants to introduce himself.
Yes, please.
You're muted, Ingamar, if you're trying to speak. Okay, well, maybe we'll be able to come back to him.
Yeah, I think sometimes Twitter Spaces is still having its growing pains. Like I've seen it be glitchy sometimes as well. So I think you want to tell us a little bit about the history of the Sovryn project. Like you said that you started contributing to it. You saw it. Like which year was this? What is the project like? Assume that there's some people in the audience. I know a lot of people already know about it. Assume there's some people in the audience that don't know what the project is. How is it built? What is it trying to do? Let's take it from there.
Yeah, so the philosophy, the design philosophy behind Sovryn and sort of like the genesis of the idea started because we were working on a decentralized network to distribute and create masks as the pandemic hit and there were massive shortages. And we wanted to allow people to donate Bitcoin and then through sort of an NFT system be able to receive sort of a digital certificate of their donation. We wanted to build it from Bitcoin. And we started looking at Rootstock, which is a Bitcoin sidechain, which is Turing complete, EVM compatible, and allows you to be able to build basically anything that you want, but has the big advantage of being able to utilize the tooling that exists and has been developed by the Ethereum community. That was our first encounter working on Rootstock, and one of the things that came out of it was a discussion that eventually turned into a manifesto that was published by Aurora, who was one of the technical founders of the project, in which she basically said, look, for too long, Bitcoin has culturally tried to ignore the developments that are happening in the rest of the crypto space. There's a huge amount of innovation that has occurred there. And we have forgotten one of the central tenets of Bitcoin. In 2011, 2012, 2014, one of the big memes was anything that is useful to Bitcoin will simply be adopted by Bitcoin. And that has, to a great extent, been culturally forgotten in Bitcoin circles. Instead, what has taken over is sort of a not built here philosophy, where anything that isn't built by Bitcoiners initially is treif, is unkosher, and therefore cannot be touched. This seems silly to us. If we believe in Bitcoin and we want to see Bitcoin grow, we should be taking advantage of everything that we that could potentially be useful to Bitcoin. And one of the key things that we had always wanted is to finally accomplish the Bitcoin mission, which is not to have to rely on intermediaries, not to have to rely on middlemen. Today, for pretty much any single use case that you want to do, most people still rely on intermediaries. Doesn't matter if it's trading or borrowing or lending, you have to go through some kind of intermediary. So you're giving up the property of Bitcoin by trying to use it. And so what we began to do is build out a protocol which was designed to allow, one, for the integration of all types of Bitcoin Layer 2. So that could include rootstock, it could include stacks, include Lightning Network, but also provided for a way to remove intermediaries. So Sovryn has a trading platform which uses an AMM, which if we want, we can talk about what that means. It has borrowing and lending. It has Bitcoin-backed stablecoins. It has margin trading. It has a platform for launching new projects. And I think one of the problems that I notice, not just in the Bitcoin community, but in all crypto communities, is I think to a great extent, people don't really understand what it is that is the innovation here. So Bitcoiners talk about digital gold. You know, it's kind of like we have, like, when the internet came out, people were trying to figure out, like, what do you do with it, right? So we have electronic mail, we have electronic newspapers, right? Everything was this, that. It was an analogy to what we have in the existing world. And Ethereum have the same problem. I think they're just as confused, if not more so. They're on the one hand trying to copy Bitcoin, not just sound money, they're ultrasound money. And on the other hand, they have these vague allusions to something like a world computer. I think that what Bitcoin is and what it represents, the innovation that it represents, is quite narrow, actually, but extremely deep. And what it represents is the instantiation of property rights in the digital sphere. And so when you look at it through that prism, you recognize that property rights are used in all sorts of ways, are incredibly important, are a fundamental basis for basically the way we live our lives, for any freedom and any free economy. And so that's being able to borrow, trade, lend, go long, and perform financial actions with your Bitcoin, but it's much more than that. And so, and what I mean by it's much more than that, it's also the ability to build out decentralized organizations which have tokens which can be used to govern them, can be used to sort of replace shares, right? So every single share owner today relies on central intermediaries in order to enforce those shares. Today we can do it on Bitcoin without a central intermediary. And so you can create ways of generating new economies. It's NFTs, which are obviously a form of digital ownership. And whether or not they're useful or not, I think they are very useful, but we can talk about that as well. So that's something which exists in Sovryn as well. And so Sovryn's goal is effectively to be an operating system for private property, for the creation of new types of private property rights, and the management of private property secured by Bitcoin, and with Bitcoin as the central currency, the central asset. And we think that that is really the only path to hyper-Bitcoinization. And so in that respect, I think we share a lot of the philosophy that Stacks has.
Yeah, I think I want to actually go back to some very interesting thing you mentioned early on, which was that if you go back to the earlier days of crypto, like 2013 is when I joined, so 13, 14, and so on, like there was this sense of like, you know, building on Bitcoin, or kind of like being more open to innovation, right? And it actually puzzles me a little bit when I see, you know, people who have clearly joined the Bitcoin ecosystem, like more recently than some of the earlier folks, who have kind of like, in a way, taken over the narrative and have made it more closed-minded, and even criticize some of the really OG people. Like I think I was noticing Eric Voorhees getting into arguments with people who are like I'm trying to avoid the term like maximalist because some people get offended by that. But let's say we're more purist on the Bitcoin sense, and they're trying to effectively say that none of the innovation, like decentralized exchanges, lending, like all sorts of other decentralized protocols, none of these things are innovations. Like all of them are scams. And Eric Voorhees is like, when did Bitcoin community become about this? Like Bitcoin was always a very open, welcoming community. Even if you think about Bitcoin itself, like you can't just hold your Bitcoin. For Bitcoin to become a reserve currency and a valuable asset in the world, you have to make it productive. And currently, you are actually relying on centralized parties. There's a logical fallacy here, right? Because people are kind of like criticizing centralized exchanges, but at the same time, the decentralized exchanges are being built not on Bitcoin, but on other ecosystems. And obviously, people, like, it's in human nature to innovate and experiment and do things. So if experimentation and innovation from a cultural perspective, like I think we can get into the technical reason as well, but from a cultural perspective, is not celebrated in an ecosystem, people are just going to go somewhere else, right? And just do that thing. And I think we're seeing that happen. Like there is some reality. And I think obviously as a Bitcoiner, and like I mostly kind of like hold Bitcoin, I've been doing that for a long time. And a lot of the other things, they seem like experiments to me. And that has been the thesis that, the good experiments from other blockchains would eventually end up on Bitcoin. But if you're being really truthful to ourselves, that's not really happening. Like if you start picking on, you mentioned NFTs, right? Let's pick NFTs. And the original NFTs were issued on Bitcoin, like Counterparty and Rare Pepes and all of that. And then there is a lag for years. And if NFTs are becoming mainstream right now, it's almost as if it's not even being remembered in the mainstream understanding that NFTs actually started on Bitcoin. Right? Like the mainstream understanding is that, the first NFTs appeared on Ethereum in this year, yada yada yada. But I feel like the type of community I'm talking about, these purists, these Bitcoin purists, they don't even think of that as that we have lost something in the Bitcoin ecosystem. They actually are like, hey, everything's a scam, right? Everything is a scam. We want none of that, and we're fine just by holding our Bitcoin. And I feel like from a cultural perspective, there is almost a need for if Bitcoin is a religion, I think there is a need for a different church within Bitcoin that is actually open to innovation, and that is, and I think without even saying it, we're seeing pockets of that. Like Stacks has obviously gathered Bitcoiners. And sometimes these people are the silent majority, right? Like the Stacks has gathered people who believe that, who want to see interesting things happen on Bitcoin. They're developers. They want to do interesting things there. Sovryn has done that. RSK has done that, and so on. So I feel like there are pockets of these people who are kind of like getting together. But it would be really interesting to see if these pockets can actually come together and can help the silent majority to break this mainstream loud voices that are very loud and are actually in many ways taking something away from Bitcoin. Like they're actually not helping Bitcoin. They're actually causing problems with Bitcoin.
Right. The way I describe it is that we are ceding the territory. We're giving up the territory. And I think we're doing it in a very dangerous way. So, like you mentioned, NFTs invented with Bitcoin. Smart contracts, that's a Nick Szabo Bitcoiner idea to begin with. Bitcoin itself has smart contracts on a limited basis on the main chain, but side chains were a concept that Bitcoin invented and were extremely popular in 2014. So what happened? And I think what happened is that Bitcoin went through an extreme cultural trauma. That extreme cultural trauma was two things happening at exactly the same time. On the one hand, you had the block size war. And the block size war was a real risk, a real danger to the principles of Bitcoin. And it created a very strong antibody reaction, right? The culture generated its antibodies. That was the origin of the censorship and the toxicity and the aggressive dismissal of easy innovation, which eventually became the dismissal of any innovation. And was an extremely polarizing experience in Bitcoin's history. What made it worse was that at exactly the same time, Ethereum was introduced and started to become popular. It became popular through Ponzi schemes and ICOs and scams. But it was also viewed as a threat to Bitcoin. And for a while there, the size of the Ethereum market cap was almost equal to the size of the Bitcoin market cap. And that was the first introduction of the flippening. And that also aggravated the problem and created this additional antibody reaction. The problem is that these antibodies have now become an autoimmune disease. They're out of control. They are recognizing even parts of the Bitcoin community itself as risks, and so what we're experiencing is sort of like this ongoing allergic inflammation within the Bitcoin community.
Yeah, that's a very interesting way to put it. Let me give my perspective on how I've seen the evolution over the years. I completely agree that I think the block wars are at the heart of it, right? It basically and the rise of the ICOs in 2017 and so on, right? And these things were kind of like going on roughly the same time. So when the block wars were going on, I was actually on the side of the small blocks, right? Like for technical reasons. But interestingly, the quote unquote big blockers were using other types of applications that should be built with Bitcoin as examples for the reasons why the blocks should be big, right? And we've seen that experiment fail, right? Like the worst form of it is Bitcoin SV, right? Like that has really big block and it's basically a mess, right? But interestingly, like if you think about the concept there, I am pro applications on Bitcoin. Like obviously I've been doing that for years and years, but I was actually against big blocks. But interestingly, the same crowd, and because the crowd kind of won, so they had to argue that Bitcoin doesn't need any applications. Like part of the fight actually became about something different, right? Instead of understanding that applications should be built in additional layers on top or side chains or other type of technology, they became anti-applications, right? But those are a bad thing. Bitcoin is fine as a simple thing. And compare that with what's happening in, let's say, the number two ecosystem, Ethereum. It is experimental. It is a little bit more reckless, but it is open to innovation as well, right? So it has the downside, but it has the plus side. So it's attracting all sorts of, organic, crazy ideas, and some of them are going to fail, some of them are scams, some of them are actually interesting things that are going to turn into really large, interesting, decentralized protocols. But at that time, the narrative was that all of the kind of like quote unquote ICO hype and marketing, like that's the only thing that's fueling Ethereum. And that's not true. Yes, there was that activity, but there were very interesting, innovative things happening as well, which could have happened somewhere else, but you're ignoring the signal by focusing too much on the noise, right? And now that I think the analogy I really like that antibodies have kind of like turned on itself, right? And they're just trying to eat the system from the inside, and that's something that we just need to snap out of it. It's not going to be easy, but I'm hopeful because I think even if you go all the way back to like Satoshi was open to applications on Bitcoin and innovation on Bitcoin, and there's like documented evidence, right? So I feel like this might be just a couple of years or some years of like a darker period, but Bitcoin is not going away, right? Like Bitcoin is not going away, and I think I'm very, very energized and excited by all the work that developers are doing, especially in our ecosystem, because I'm more familiar with it. But I feel like once people start seeing the value of these applications and smart contracts around on the ecosystem, I think the other voices are going to start dying down. Go ahead, Patrick.
Oh, hey, just chiming in. Yeah, I love Yago, what you were saying about the antibody. There's actually a term for this in mimetic theory. It's called a meme allergy, and essentially, it's like a distaste for a type of meme. And I think largely in 2017, essentially all these ICOs, like some of the ICOs were good, by the way. Like it's worth noting. But like all these ICOs were essentially like a DDoS attack against these folks' brains. And the simple thing to do was just shut it all out and just focus on Bitcoin. And that can be helpful from a community standpoint, kind of like reinforcing the meme of digital gold and like focusing this quote unquote product to be positioned as such. And like, focusing on its strengths. It's not going to change very often. It's highly secure, et cetera, et cetera. But I think I have 2 points I wanted to make. One is to continue essentially shutting up the idea of different blockchains being anchored into Bitcoin or innovation happening on Bitcoin is effectively the same as like a dry drunk who is warning everyone else not to drink because they can't handle their own liquor. And I think it also misses a broader point that I don't think they fully realize, which is that, like, if you kind of like take a step back 30,000 feet, like blockchains kind of look like cap tables, and I'd even go as far as to say blockchains scale cap tables, and in doing so, you'd actually want as many of those cap tables attached to Bitcoin as humanly possible, so that Bitcoin as a settlement layer becomes more valuable. And you like show up to a Bitcoin conference, people got their own planes organized by companies that planes that are run by companies that are organized by cap tables. I think there's like a big point here that's being missed, which is, Bitcoin is not just for money. I think it's like for civilization, for all sorts of different ways of organizing people, not just on Bitcoin, but in regards to different ideas they might have. Like, I'll sort of stop there, but I really think. Actually, one last point. If these folks who are like hyper purist actually mattered, Coinbase wouldn't have been a $200 some odd billion IPO. So I actually think it's in our best interest to appreciate Bitcoin not changing and appreciate them for holding on to that, but to essentially safely ignore these folks and build. We don't have a choice. We're not gonna make the mistake that they're making by focusing on them.
So I think there's no question that Bitcoin maximalism makes Bitcoin dumber, and it makes Bitcoin dumber because it's an enforced ignorance of what is happening in the rest of the world. And it's an ignorance that now primarily results from fear. Fear of other things taking pride of place from Bitcoin, and fear that there might actually be something interesting and valuable there. And when you are too scared to look at what is going on, you become ignorant and dumb. So I actually don't think that this maximalism is a form of Bitcoin purism. It is, it's a profit purism. It misses the point of Bitcoin. Bitcoin started out and was designed for a world in which we have a sense of adventure, a sense of technological innovation, a sense that we can solve our problems through the application of technology, and specifically through the application of cryptography for the empowerment of individuals. Bitcoin maximalism misses that point, and it misses that point in two extremely dangerous and fundamental ways. The first is that if you are not building the tools which are going to allow you to get rid of intermediaries for use of your Bitcoin, then you're going to be relying on intermediaries, and you're it's, do you even Bitcoin, bro? Like, if you're using decentralized intermediaries, they are the weak spots in your Bitcoin use. But it's dangerous in a even more fundamental way, which is that if we want to build an economy which is based on cryptography, decentralization, and our ability to remove elites from positions of power, who can censor the way we behave, censor our transactions, then we want to do it in all things so that we can use Bitcoin as a money. Bitcoin, if it is not tied to an economy, is not a money. And that economy needs to be built with the same principles of Bitcoin, because Bitcoin is not useful for an economy which is totally reliant on centralized powers for everything else. Now, right now, the sort of building out decentralized economies is occurring theoretically, primarily in other places, all of these other smart contract chains, so to speak. But the problem is that they don't adhere to Bitcoin's principles either. And if we cede the territory to them, if they became the best alternative or the best representation of building out decentralized economies, then what you're going to end up with is what the head of the SEC rightly called dinos, right? Decentralized in name only. And that is extremely attractive to everyone in the status quo, because they look at proof of stake of that kind. They look at chains of those kinds and they say, this is perfect. This is something we know exactly how to co-opt. This looks actually very similar to the world that we already exist in. And if we aren't able to build out Bitcoin as a credible alternative, not just on a monetary layer, but on the financial and economic layer as well, then Bitcoin is never going to be able to accomplish its mission, and we're never going to be as free and as sovereign as we could be if we followed the initial sense of innovation and the path of adventure and courage through cryptographic innovation that Bitcoin started.
Hey, this is Englandia. I just wanted to add to that, that anything that Bitcoin can't currently do, that gives someone else reason to start their own coin, a less decentralized chain, a weaker chain that they'll use to build what Bitcoin can't do. So I think the mission of Sovryn is anything that can add to what Bitcoin can do must be adopted by Bitcoin. And we're trying to add those superpowers to Bitcoin to maintain that foothold in decentralized finance.
Yep. So I absolutely agree with all of this, and I think of it this way, that if you think of blockchains as almost like sovereign nations, so Bitcoin is the most kind of decentralized, money for the people by the people. So it's like a sovereign nation, right? And somebody else is also trying to build a sovereign nation, but you can disagree with some of the values, and you're like, no, Bitcoin is better because it's more decentralized, more secure, whatever your reason. But you should be interested in making your sovereign nation more powerful, right? And for it to have an independent economy. And interestingly, what's happening is that some of this culture of being a purist is actually hurting the economy, is actually hurting the power of the sovereign nation itself, right? And people are they're not fully realizing it. They're a little bit blindfolded. They just dismiss everything as that's not innovation. We'll see in a bear market where market caps are for some of these competitors, yada, yada, yada. But interestingly, you can't deny the number of developers. Like you can just go to GitHub, right? You can just go and there are independent reports out there about things like Electro Capital, where people are just counting the number of developers who are building on Bitcoin, or building on Ethereum, or building on Polkadot or Solana or some of the chains, and you can just block them, right? Like developers have not a lot of interest in like these culture wars or whatever. They're just using the toolings that they like, and they want to do interesting things. And the facts are there that Bitcoin is being left behind, right? Interestingly, in these circles, I've noticed a trend, right? So the trend is that they for every innovation, let's call it like smart contracts, or let's focus on smart contracts for a minute. Like they would always have some sort of a half-baked proposal written that goes out of its way to implement that feature with the goal of not having a token. So the goal is not to implement the feature in the best possible way. The goal is to implement it in some sort of weird way so that in the end you don't have a token, right? And I can give examples of this. And then those things are half-baked. They're like vague ideas, half-baked, never been implemented, never been deployed. But now they have something to point to, right? So they would say whenever, let's say I'm talking about stacks, and I'm talking about what we have done, they would point to DLCs or RGB. By the way, the computer scientist in me loves the fact that DLCs, the ideas exist, or RGB exists. It's great, but most people don't understand what the differences are. Right? These are smart contract programming languages, which are off-chain, meaning that to use them, you actually have to coordinate with the person that you're trying to interact with before executing the contract, right? So these are extremely limited type of programming languages, because it's a non-starter. If I tell you that, hey, you can either go on Uniswap and just trade any asset you want, connect to this global network, and just make any trade, and it will basically clear in a few seconds, versus find a person on the planet who is willing to make a trade with you, sit down with that person, make these 100 computations with that person, and then you have to broadcast like first this, first that. It's a non-starter. Nobody's ever going to use that at all, right? But they have this theoretical idea to point to that these off-chain type of languages can exist or do exist in some form or the other, and they are somehow a replacement for a fully expressive smart contract language where you can have global contracts that are live all the time, and you can interact with them, and you can have the DeFi building blocks to actually build on top. Right? I know, Yago, you're trying to say something. I'll pause.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, it's a perfect example of one of the paradoxes of maximalism, which is on the one hand, they will say Bitcoin doesn't need to be able to do everything on main chain. The perfect is the enemy of the good, and if you try to cram everything onto the main chain, you're going to end up with a suboptimal system, which is true. But then whenever they are looking to introduce these additional systems, they talk about hypothetical perfect systems where there's no trade-offs and where they exist only in people's imagination. It's kind of like if we were going to say, well, we're not going to develop the internet until we have the perfect mesh internet, right? The perfect mesh network. Well, then what would happen is you would not be able to develop while, the internet itself exists. So I completely agree with what you're saying. The future is created every single moment in the present, right? We need to be building now towards that future and waiting for these, perfect systems to arrive, and that's going to solve everything. Is a very confused path and never works.
Yep, I agree, right? So similarly, building up on the theoretical ideas, right? Like imagine the work that we've done with stacks. People who are not familiar with it, think of that as sometimes I call it a layer 1.5. it has some properties of a layer 1, some properties of a layer 2. It connects to Bitcoin, brings like full-fledged smart contracts to Bitcoin, meaning anything you can do on Ethereum, you could do it on this smart contract layer for Bitcoin. It can read Bitcoin state. You can interact with smart contracts just through pure Bitcoin transactions. A lot of interesting things. I'll put that on the side. But people would then compare it to, no, but you know, there are space chains, and with space chains, you don't need a token. I'm like, does a space chain even exist? Right? It's a highly theoretical idea from years ago that has never been implemented. I can point theoretical flaws in it, but it probably doesn't even matter because, you know, it hasn't been built, and it will probably never be built, right? So I think the existence of these theoretical ideas basically give them cover, right? That to stand on some sort of a moral high ground. That if you really want to build like a additional functionality with Bitcoin, here is the morally right way to do it. I've actually been on podcasts with Bitcoiners where they would use moral arguments that if you raise capital and you're trying to build something, somehow you're doing something morally wrong. I'm like, this is how Silicon Valley works. You realize that? Like this is literally how the internet was built. This is how Google was built. This is how, you know, all of the software you use every day to actually, you know, if you have an Apple computer, like this is how Apple was built. These things they were funded by investors, and this thing has a long history. Like even you can go back hundreds of years. Whenever somebody wanted to do something crazy and new and innovative, they would have to go around and ask for risky capital to come in and to build these things, right? So they would rather. Yeah, go ahead.
I would go even further than that. Bitcoin maximalists have, without noticing, become communists. Just like communists, they point at a system which exists only in theory. And when it's not working in practice, well, they say, well, if we only just made it more exactly the way I say it should be, then it would work. They make moral arguments instead of pragmatic arguments. But worst of all, and the way in which they are most like communists, is they deny the idea that incentives work. They deny the idea that funding is necessary. And this is absurd because Satoshi Nakamoto, one of the most genius things that he did is he introduced the mimetic seed into this piece of code that he wrote, which made it market itself. And the way it marketed itself was through the incentives of early people being able to get rich. And the way it protects itself is through the incentives of proof of work, which is miners being able to make money. Incentives are the only thing that works. And if you're trying to build a system which protects property rights, and at the same time you've adopted the moral philosophy of a communist, you are extremely confused.
Yep, I agree. Here's the fascinating part, right? The fascinating part is that there are these logical paradoxes that this type of thinking can hit, right? And you pointed to one of them. And interestingly, and obviously, like I want to be respectful to this community. You know, I try not to even use the term maximalist because some people have pointed to me that they find it offensive. So I'm trying to use the term purist. I think they're all coming from a good place, right? Like it's like the grassroots movement, and they had to protect Bitcoin from a grassroots point of view from during the block size wars and all of that. And some of this simplistic type of language, it's very easy to understand as well, right? Like it's super easy to understand this language. So I think I don't blame them. Like some of this messaging is coming from, you know, more prominent figures, and it makes a lot of sense. And people can't dig deeper. So let me point out one of the logical fallacies. So the logical fallacy is they would love to see, you know, some sort of a layer around Bitcoin that has this additional functionality, but they don't want that layer to have a separate gas app. Okay, great. So Blockstream, by the way, they do amazing work. Highly respect them. You know, they have the liquid sidechain, and the liquid sidechain is actually a federation. You are relying on a federation of a handful of people to use the network, and Bitcoiners love that. They are for freedom. They are for open permissionless systems, but they like a federated system, and they're completely fine with it. On the other hand, you could have a open permissionless system, which is stacks, And it is permissionless because it has incentives baked in for the miners to come in and participate and run the network. Right? Just like Bitcoin has. Bitcoin has incentives for it to be permissionless. Anyone can come and be a miner. They don't like the open permissionless system. They would prefer a federated system, which is a logical fallacy because as the Bitcoiner, you should always prefer the permissionless open system where you don't need anyone's permission and you can just go and use the network and you're not trusting anyone, right? Because now you're trusting a federation. So I think these types of logical fallacies appear when people are not thinking through, when they are not realizing that they are actually moving away from innovation, they're moving away from capital markets, they're moving away from incentive-based structures that support innovation.
Yes, and they're moving away from the principles of Bitcoin, which is why I actually don't like particularly the term Bitcoin purist that you're using, because I don't think they are pure Bitcoin. I think they are the Bitcoin confused. So
yeah, it's a good one. I think Shannon, maybe you want to have some questions or
we do. Yeah, we're getting flooded with questions. Brad, go ahead with yours.
No, I didn't really have a question. It's just that I had some thoughts that came up when they were talking about some of these things, and I just wonder how many, what percentage of Bitcoiners, there's a lot of them that probably don't feel the need or they don't see the opportunity that smart contracts can provide. I think a lot of them think that just going after, a good percentage of the market cap of gold is enough, and they've been fighting, the hard money war for so long that they've forgotten about, some of the things that Muneeb was talking about earlier that were early, technology things that were being built on top of Bitcoin. So I think that's been part of it.
Yep. Brad, first of all, great to see you here and hear your voice. I don't think we've chatted over a voice before, but I think you're on point. I think that a lot of them, they focus on the hard money use case, which is a really big use case, right? And they are not interested in other things. And I would understand that if these things weren't interconnected. And let me explain that. Right? Like let's say if you're saying, hey, I'm only focused on the hard money use case, I'm only focused on the store of value digital gold use case, and I don't care about anything else. Absolutely. I'm a big believer in freedom. If that's your choice, you get to do that, you focus on it. But I feel like these things are interrelated because here's what's happened. I think Bitcoin right now, if we are being honest, Bitcoin is gaining more traction in the real world. Like in the sense, if you look at Latin America or certain countries where, El Salvador, or if you're looking at real use cases where people are using Bitcoin in extreme circumstances and it's really like, their livelihood depends on it. I think Bitcoin is actually winning and Bitcoin is the real alternative for money. But if you look at the digital world, if you look at, what is the currency people are using to buy NFTs or they're using to take loans, right? Like a put up as collateral and take a USD loan there. It's actually Ethereum, right? Like it's very little Bitcoin. It's wrapped Bitcoin, which is like 1% of Bitcoin. It's pretty small. And I think you have to admit that there is some reasoning behind things like Ethereum can become money because they are the default money for the digital world. It's not the default money for the real world right now because it's not focused on it. It has other types of issues. I see that. But if you can't use Bitcoin online for all these use cases, if I can't put up Bitcoin collateral and take a USD loan, if I can't just buy random things online very easily, like I can bid into an NFT use case, if I can't do that, if those things are not developing around the hard money of Bitcoin, they're actually developing somewhere else, where it's more natural for me to use that cryptocurrency, I feel like we're missing out on a large use case of the money itself. And interestingly, the point that Yago was talking about earlier was that how can you be okay with using your hard money, decentralized money on a centralized exchange? or some sort of a centralized service provider. You should be interested in building this decentralized infrastructure around the hard money, and that decentralized infrastructure absolutely cannot exist without smart contracts.
So I'd approach this from two directions. There's the upside and the downside. I'll start with the downside. The digital gold use case is powerful and what attracted me to Bitcoin in the first place. But gold is highly limited. Gold is not a money today. It has been replaced by fiat. Now, there's this theory, the hyper-Bitcoinization theory that most Bitcoiners will tell you, is that Bitcoin is going to continue growing. It's going to have a larger and larger market cap. And then eventually, at some point, as a result, it will become money. Gold has a market cap that is 12 times the size of Bitcoin, and gold is not a money. Gold in 1936 was made illegal to hold by individuals. And that was easy because everyone was holding their gold with centralized parties. And this happened in the freest country in the world. So if that can happen to gold with thousands of years of history in the freest country in the world, it can happen today with Bitcoin as well. But it's worse than that because there more and more of our lives are being spent in the digital realm. There's a game called Axie Infinity, which is an NFT game that runs on Ethereum, which has millions of people playing it. Probably millions of Filipinos make money by breeding NFTs for wealthier Westerners who fund this activity. These are people who live their entire economic lives in these digital worlds. This is not an outlier, it's just a leading indicator. And they're doing it outside of Bitcoin. So if you have to ask where is a full cycle economy happening, right? You go to the Philippines today, you can spend Axie Infinity money in stores because so many people are using it. Now, when you have hundreds of millions of people who are playing online games, and these online games become a significant part of the real economy because suddenly they're property rights, right? So millions of people play World of Warcraft and they grind all day. Millions of people play EVE Online and they grind all day. And if they could, they would turn it into a full-time job. But because those places are basically the Soviet Union, you can't get the funds in, you can't get the funds out. There are no property rights. They never developed into true economies. But now they'll start being built and are being built as open economies. And so you're going to have hundreds of millions of gamers who have hundreds of millions of wallets. And this is the money that they earn for their livelihood, and it's the way they're going to spend. That's a true economy. And Bitcoin is nowhere to be seen in the first instantiation of a true economy, which is built with cryptographic money. I would say inferior cryptographic money, but cryptographic money nonetheless. So that's the downside. The downside is that Bitcoin does become digital gold and plays as important a role in the economy of the future as gold plays in our economy, which is to say, not very much of one at all. Now there's the upside. The upside is that we introduce a world and an economy where property rights are guaranteed through cryptography. And therefore, people around the world have access because it's borderless. We have property rights which are secured without violence because it doesn't rely on centralized parties and it doesn't rely on governments. And this entire world and this entire economy is built outside the purview of the current nation state, which means that all of us achieve a degree of freedom, a degree of mobility that we today cannot experience. But beyond that, it's the creation of an entirely new economic frontier, which brings trillions of people who today are cut out of the economy into the economy. And if you look at the last time we had a new frontier, which introduced property rights, that place was the United States of America. What made the United States the most wealthy and powerful country in the world was that it was a new frontier where people could create new rules and innovations but it also had property rights. So it wasn't Brazil, it wasn't Argentina. And now you take this and you've got this entirely new frontier that we are creating for ourselves, that we will live in, that our children will live in. You introduce property rights, but there's no end to the frontier. The United States ended in California, right? You got to California, nowhere else to go. The digital realm is infinite. We are about to enter into the greatest period of wealth creation in human history, with the combination of secure property rights for all of humankind in a digital infinite realm. This is going to be the adventure of our coming, century. And Bitcoin is either going to rule it or it's going to be an afterthought.
Yago, those games you were talking about with millions of users, are those actually on blockchains?
Yes, the assets are held on Ethereum.
Axie took off recently, and then there are some of the other games as well. We're now looking at blockchains. There is some interest in Lightning. I'm very bullish on Lightning. I think there's some interest in integrating Lightning payments in some of these games as well that I'm very excited about. But generally, I agree. I think there's a lot more that could be done with the gaming economy, the earn-to-play type of models that are emerging. And again, you can't have that with Bitcoin because you're missing the infrastructure. You're missing the smart contract layer and the other building blocks, and you need to rapidly kind of like catch up there because otherwise you can't get the application use cases.
Muneeb, is it those games don't show up on DApp.com because they just don't track those or something? Because I've gone up on DApp, before just to see like what are some of the higher volume applications, that are running, and it's always like Uniswap or maybe a couple of other ones, but they have way fewer daily users. Very small. I was surprised actually.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the way to look at the volumes is if you look recently, if you look at the fee being burned on Ethereum, for example, recently OpenSea came up a lot. So that's NFT trading, right? And then Uniswap is usually up there. It was usually number one, but these days number two. But I think if you go down, Axie has been in the top 5, 6, but not all the activity of Axie results in fee being burned, being used on Ethereum. Right, so the game kind of like runs separately. I actually haven't done a deeper dive into how exactly it runs, but part of the economy is powered through the implementation they have in Ethereum, and it's actually quite active. Like at least if you go to there are these various websites that track fees being burned. I think Axie would end up in the top 5 or so applications recently, but it wasn't there before. It's a last 1 or 2 month type of thing.
Ferric, go ahead with your question.
No, I was just going to follow up on that DApp thing. So I was thinking, I wonder if that's another one of the reasons why Bitcoin maximalists don't really pay much attention to it, or think that the whole smart contract DApp thing isn't really important, because it's sort of like what I would think of as the way the internet was looked at by a lot of people before like Hotmail came about. Right? All of a sudden, there was a killer app that made everybody wake up and see the potential.
Don't worry about the virus. Only 6 people have it.
Yeah, no, I think you have an interesting point, right? Like I think because you can't take the viewpoint that everything is a scam, right? Which is kind of like the default viewpoint, sadly, in a lot of the circles. I have to come up with a good name, Yago. You just told me Purist is not a good name. So if you have that lens that hey, everything is a scam, you're not curious anymore, right? Like you're not curious to go and try out things. You're not curious to see where the signal is. Even if 90 or 99% of it is noise, right? Which I don't think is the case. You're still missing the signal, right? And the signal could be the next killer app that creates the digital economy, and people are using it. Like I think there are some insane stats like a significant portion of the GDP in Philippines is now being powered by these play to earn type of game models, which are literally running on Ethereum.
Ferric, go ahead with your question.
Yeah, so I guess my take, I will admit I lean a little more towards Maxi at times just because of the fact that like I see a lot of altcoins that are just complete garbage. In personal opinion, like they just are without like an end product that you can really envision. But like I'm not gonna say that things like NFTs and stuff don't have potential. Like I do see it. It just depends on what they're representing. Like if you can get houses or deeds and titles and stuff like that, royalties onto it as primarily like your trademark or something, then NFTs are much better because they cut out the notary reliance. I've personally known of instances where you've had a corrupt notary here, like in the United States, which costs people money. So because you're reliant on that relatively low paid, not necessarily trustworthy person. But like with tokens and stuff, I see more potential. For example, with Sovryn, I see potential with the concept of that idea where you have the governance and profit sharing concept, and bringing even companies to try to be on with their governance on Bitcoin for that security, and just try to cut out stocks as a concept or transfer them over. That way you could utilize smart contracts and stuff to do your dividend payouts and have more input from your actual shareholders. I don't know. It just seems like for me, a token has to actually represent an asset of some kind to be creating actual value instead of just being a token for the sake of a token, which sometimes that's what it is. I don't know if that makes sense where I'm coming from, but
yeah, I think that makes complete sense, right? So what I would say is this was actually a really helpful framework, especially in the early years, like 2016, 2017, when there was this DDoS attack of scam ICOs on the industry, where anyone is writing a white paper saying here's a token, and they'll try to find a use case for it. And there have been a bunch of SEC enforcements on these things recently. The regulators are catching up because scammers are going to scam, right? Whatever new tooling is available, they'll try to use it. My thing over here is that you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's a little bit like the devil is always in the details, right? So if there are, let's say, 9,000 tokens on CoinMarketCap, you ask any reasonable person that, what do you think is the probability that 1% of them are actually honest, legitimate teams that are working on something interesting, right? If you're really not even willing to admit that it could be even 1%, then there's some sort of a logical thing going on over there, right? Obviously there could be 1% or more than 1% probability, but if you translate that into a number, that might actually be 100 projects, right? Which is a lot. And I think that's where the devil is always in the details, because you have to go and you have to see that the type of teams who are actually starting some of these projects that do have new tokens, they're teams that 20 years ago would have been building the Googles back then, right? So they're really high quality teams. They're sophisticated engineers. These people know what they're doing, and these people can actually raise capital, right? VCs are willing to throw money at them because they would throw money at them for whatever they were doing. These are highly capable engineers, but they're deciding to enter crypto. They're deciding to build something here because it's the next frontier. And they do have a valid use case for some of those tokens involved. I get that pushback all the time, and I tell them that, look, right, all of our code is open source on Stacks. Why don't you fork it and run it without the token and then see what happens? Right? Everything's public, and it's a gas fee. You are paying the gas fee to the miners to execute your computations. Why would they execute your computations if you don't pay them? Right? And I think slowly people even folks were very much anti. I think because of this DDoS attack on the community of all sorts of scams, there's this natural reaction, and I think we're missing the opportunity because of the past history.
Well, I would just say real quick though, like I have less pushback on stacks, for example, because you guys are utilizing your token, but you're also utilizing like Bitcoin in the same thing. Like you can earn Bitcoin by staking. It's not all purely just you guys are issuing out your, like, you know what I'm saying? Like it's not where it's all, there's like that, you're utilizing Bitcoin as that actual like money still, that main asset. Whereas let's just say Ethereum, right? It's going to be staking, you get the Ethereum. I mean, Ethereum's a better example than most others, I guess, which are not nearly as developed, and they're literally just printing it for you. It's just one of those things though, where a lot seem like they are, like you said, they're just trying to get venture capital, but you're not actually gaining ownership. Like you're really reliant on this token becoming something major. And it's a little bit different than like Stacks and Sovryn, which have that fee-based thing utilizing Bitcoin as well. So it's just, you see what I'm getting? It's like you're buying a stock, but you're not getting the actual benefits of buying a stock.
I broadly agree with you that you want assets to represent a type of value. Now, there's all kinds of types of value. Some of them are going to be purely digital, like what we were talking about with NFTs and Axie Infinity. But ultimately, if we want to be able to live our lives free, and if we want to be able to reduce corruption in the real world, which is the world we actually live in, then we need to engage with that real world. And so one of the things that you mentioned was, for example, mortgages and deed and title to property. With Sovryn, we're going to be introducing that over the coming months. There's going to be the ability for bankless mortgages. There's going to be the ability to acquire property which is registered and managed entirely through the Sovryn platform. And this will be bundled with other ways of managing your life. So, I'm engaged. We have a plan that our sort of marriage, so to speak, will never be instantiated by any government, but it will be instantiated by our commitment to each other via a smart contract, which is effectively, a marriage is a legal partnership. And we're going to have the rules of the legal partnership and the management of the funds of the legal partnership managed by a smart contract. And one of the reasons to do that is because a smart contract doesn't require us to rely on any particular country, but also because it's vastly more precise. We have two types of law now, which we didn't before. We only had one type of law. We had liberal arts law, or what I call literary law, right? Literary law is written down by human beings in extremely dense and difficult to understand language, which is always open to interpretation, and therefore it needs to be judged and managed by courts which have discretionary powers to interpret. And so ultimately, your entire case comes down to, does the judge or the jury feel good, or did they have their lunch today? Smart contracts do not have that property. They have the property of a high degree of specificity because code needs to be deterministic. And that provides clarity, and that provides efficiency in execution. We can rebuild the entire legal system on these principles. And that is part of the project of what Sovryn is engaged in now. It's not something we talk about a lot because it's a very big project. And right now, we are mostly engaged in sort of the fundamental financial aspects of trading, lending, and Bitcoin-backed stable coins, because that is a huge property. And already, there's tens of millions of dollars using those things on Sovryn. But the ambition here is to create an operating system for decentralized private property so that people can manage their entire stack, their entire lives. And so the point that you make, right, which is that we have the ability to make fundamental change, and we don't need to be just thinking sort of, if you look at the Ethereum ecosystem, it's extremely self-referential. and Ethereum became available because we was used to buy ICOs, and now the apps that run on Ethereum are available because the tokens that we're creating, the ICOs, can be traded. It's extremely self-referential economy. It doesn't make it an irrelevant economy, but it means that its impact on our lives is limited. And I think the beauty of the Bitcoin community and the Bitcoin ethos is that it was founded for the purpose of introducing real change into the lives of people. We see it in El Salvador, we see it in Stacks, we see it in Sovryn, and we need to remind Bitcoin maxis that that was the point all along.
Yeah, I just want to quickly add here that there was a very interesting point earlier that, okay, if you're building in the Bitcoin ecosystem, and let's say, Stacks has this Bitcoin yield and you're earning Bitcoin, you feel the connection to Bitcoin, and Bitcoiners feel good about it, that's great. But I actually would say that if you look at other blockchains, there are many L1 blockchains now, Ethereum, Solana, Avalanche, others, like you can't just discard the innovation happening on those places because they actually are very powerful systems, right? Like they're generic, computing platforms, they're very powerful. And when the underlying cryptocurrencies start getting used in applications in the digital world, if people are using the underlying cryptocurrency, which is not Bitcoin, in NFTs, for trading NFTs or for trading on decentralized exchanges, over time, even in people's minds, it starts to turning into money, right? Because that is money in the digital world. And I feel like right now, given the broader direction in the Bitcoin ecosystem, so Bitcoin has a lead. Like Bitcoin has a lead on becoming the default internet currency right now. Because in the real world, Bitcoin has more traction. But on the digital side of things, Bitcoin doesn't have traction, and it doesn't have traction because smart contracts for Bitcoin are not widely accepted yet, even by the Bitcoin community itself. And I think that is the thing that I want to highlight. Like, it's not like I want people to be scared that, hey, some other ecosystem is going to become internet money. I think we need to be very realistic about what is happening in the ecosystem. There is a ton of more developer activity outside of Bitcoin than inside of Bitcoin. Yes, obviously, I'm very proud of the stuff that is happening in Stacks. There are 30 plus startups that are doing interesting things. In the grand scheme of things, in the broader Bitcoin ecosystem, like obviously Yago is there from Sovryn. I think there are small pockets of interesting things happening, but the big giant like Bitcoin itself, has somehow gone very silent on innovation and on being very open to the idea of you want to be digital money, not like in the real world, but also in the digital world. And the digital world comes with these use cases. It comes with NFTs. It comes with decentralized exchanges, all sorts of weird, innovative, creative things that are going on. You kind of my goal here is that using the network effects of Bitcoin that already exist, you can plug in the gap on the smart contract side and just enable the developer to bring all these use cases to the Bitcoin system, right? Like that's what fascinates me, and that's what keeps me up and excited and working. But I think people need to realize the size of that opportunity or the size of the missed opportunity if you don't do that in the Bitcoin ecosystem.
Yago, go ahead with your question. Okay. Going once. David, do you have a question?
Yeah. Hey guys, thanks for doing this. The first part of the conversation was awesome. Just very cool, kind of philosophical and kind of aligning on the ethos of Bitcoin. I'm curious, are there any ways that Stacks and Sovryn would or are collaborating together? And then on top of that, maybe each one of you can say something about the other protocol that maybe you're envious of, or that you think is very cool that they're doing that you're not doing on your own platform. I know it's a tough question if you may not know the intricacies of the platform, but I'm just curious.
Yago, you want to go first?
Sure. I think we would be very happy to, and we've spoken a number of times. I've spoken with Muneeb about ways in which we could look to collaborate. With Sovryn, we have, I think, a different approach from maybe pretty much any other project, in that we see ourselves as building a system which isn't tied to any particular chain, with the exception of Bitcoin. The reason it's tied to Bitcoin is because we believe that Bitcoin is the only truly decentralized monetary system, but also the only truly decentralized and incorruptible property rights system that we could use. But we are integrating every aspect of the Bitcoin layer 2 ecosystem. We started with Rootstock. We're now integrating Lightning Network, and we're looking at aspects of the Stacks ecosystem that we could integrate. So one particularly interesting thing that Stacks allows is the ability to, through smart contracts, manipulate Bitcoin on main chain, which is a very valuable property. And so tying all of this together, rather than sort of being on a particular chain, or rather being an application layer system, Sovryn is a protocol, but it's a protocol without a chain and without a coin. And what holds it together is its governance system. And ultimately, we think that that is vastly more valuable and has much more of a network effect than any chain. I think if you look at Ethereum, for example, there has long been a theory that Ethereum has a network effect. There is the theory that layer ones would sort of collect all of the value, the protocols would collect all of the value. What we're seeing is that in practice, the network effect isn't in Ethereum. Solana is growing very quickly. BSC is growing very quickly. Polygon is growing very quickly. Together, they do about 8 times as many. They have about 8 times as many daily users as Ethereum, and they don't have nearly as much value on them yet. But that's primarily because of sort of like the Ponzinomics that I was describing earlier, where Ethereum has had many, many more years to build a self-referential economy than these other chains have had. And so where is the network effect? The network effect is in the EVM. So Sovryn is a set of tools, which is in some ways akin to the EVM, and it's a governance system. And we believe that that's where a network effect lies. So we're happy to work with many different systems, particularly with a focus on Bitcoin layer 2. And we're actively looking for the right ways in which to integrate the Stacks ecosystem into that.
Yep, thanks, Yago. So we've actually talked about this. Super excited about potentially working together. And again, Stacks is a decentralized ecosystem. My company, Hiro, actually builds developer tools. So I think it could be very interesting to see what type of developer tooling or some sort of integrations that could be done. Because currently, my understanding is, Sovryn, at least some of the smart contracts actually run on Rootstock, right? So RSK and Stacks are more comparable because they're both smart contract platforms, and we have a different clarity language. We have different type of properties available, like native Bitcoin swaps on the Stacks side. It'd be great to see how that could be integrated into the Sovryn ecosystem, right? Because they have integrated RSK already, and I think they could do potentially interesting things with Stacks as well. And in terms of like what I've seen them do really well, I actually love the storytelling, right? Like Yago was earlier talking about this manifesto that came out, the type of even storytelling on their website and so on. It's like, I love it. I think they've done a great job on telling people like why this is important in an interesting way, in an intriguing way, and kind of like gaining a bunch of interest from Bitcoiners, which is great. I feel like especially like, our early team was basically all computer scientists, right? So I think over time, we've become better at like telling the story of Stacks, but obviously that is something that we can definitely improve on.
Yago, are you ready for your question?
Yes, sorry. I had some problems here with the microphone. But first off, I just wanted to say that I really, really believe in Sovryn, and I'm really thrilled to be able to speak to Yago here on this panel. So I guess my question
question, and I'm not trying to be controversial or anything. Mostly, I'm concerned about like the steps for moving forward, as to, because right now at the way it stands, there's a dichotomy between the decentralized economy that we're all eagerly trying to put together and build and spread like wildfire. But if you look at the sheer numbers, the sheer volume of money and transactions and that kind of thing, but crypto is still pretty much a growing niche. However, I see that there's a lot of protocols and a few of them more successful than others in trying to integrate the traditional legacy banking / financial rails into the decentralized economy. And I was wondering if there was any kind of longer reaching strategy on your part on Bitcoin layer 2 or Ethereum or any other solutions that would try to tackle, and how to tackle the regulatory hurdles that are still kind of in a way there's still a barrier to widespread adoption. And it's just an open question. I'm not really trying to imply any solution better than the other. And I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you, Yago, and thanks for the support. Let me try and rephrase the question to make sure that I understand it. And if I understand the question, it is that currently one of the difficulties for us to grow a truly decentralized economy is the fact that the regulators are trying to clamp down on this economy. Is that the question?
In a way, yes. Regulators are, I wouldn't say necessarily clamp down. There's two sides of the coin. Some of them are more open and more really trying to understand the technology. Some of them are really scared about what's going to happen. But on the side of a solution like Sovryn, for example, at some point to try to actually bring in more. I mean, the world we live in still runs on fiat, and although I would really hope that that would give way to a more decentralized approach to money, I can see that the path to it might be a longer path working with regulators, and I was just wondering if there was a plan or a position that you had with regards to how you connect the regulated traditional world with the decentralized aspects of it, especially with the onboarding and the acceptance. And I'm not saying the El Salvador path is the right one, but do you have any thoughts on that, on any plans, any discussions having had around that?
Yes, so we have a lot of thoughts and plans around that, but I'll describe three. First is, I believe that Bitcoin-backed stablecoins are game over. Not in the short term, but in the medium and long term. And in the short term, they're going to become extremely valuable. And the reason is that all of the stablecoins that you're looking at, USDC, Tether, all of them are becoming more and more regulated. There's vastly more pressure on them. And in the Ethereum ecosystem, there's very few truly principled alternatives which are decentralized. We're building Bitcoin-backed stablecoins, and we are going to be able to introduce them and are introducing them. They can be used by anyone, anywhere for standard commerce. Countries like El Salvador, we have work that we are doing there to allow that to be introduced. El Salvador is a unique case because El Salvador is a dollarized country which wants to use Bitcoin. That is like the perfect use case for Bitcoin-backed stablecoins. But there's other work where we have strategic investors and we have partners who are looking to provide debit cards, provide on-ramps and off-ramps. There's going to be an off-ramp being integrated to Sovryn probably over the coming few weeks. And so this will allow you to do a few things. One, it will allow people to use Bitcoin for daily commerce without even having to understand Bitcoin. And to do so anywhere in the world. in a way in which the regulator is unable, because it is truly decentralized, to censor those transactions. Second, it will allow Bitcoiners to have a dollar or really any currency, fiat type liquidity, to basically to live in fiat, but never have to sell a coin, because they can use those coins to generate those dollars. And in fact, there's one of the teams that is working on Sovryn is working on a protocol which will be released probably over the next 6 or 7 weeks, which is called Zero, which will allow you to borrow against your Bitcoin, these Bitcoin-backed stable coins at 0 interest rates. So you'll never have to sell, and you won't even have to worry when you pay the interest. But that's on one level. That's a purely technological level, and therefore it's easy to integrate. There's a second level, and that's sort of what I've already mentioned. El Salvador, I believe, is not the last country to adopt Bitcoin. I believe it is the first. It is a leader, and we will be able to provide the same types of benefits that we are looking to provide to El Salvador across countries across the world. And then third level is the most ambitious, but I think is extremely realistic. Maybe you know that I have been very involved in the Free Cities project, which is the effort to create autonomous zones. I think that what we're building with Sovryn is a nation, a sovereign nation. I think many different nations are going to be created, and they're going to exist partly in the virtual world and partly in the real world. But for them to exist partly in the real world, they will need to have their own autonomous jurisdictions. And I think that we are probably closer than most people think to having autonomous jurisdictions of exactly that sort. So people who want to have the highest degree of freedom are going to be able to use the most powerful tool they have, which is not voting, but leaving and resettling themselves in frontiers which are kind of like stargates, connecting their digital assets to the real world, allowing them to live on Bitcoin and to have access to competitive governance and to have a degree of freedom, which I don't think regular people have ever had the ability to experience in the course of human history. I'm extremely optimistic about where we're going. I think we're building something which is fundamentally important, not for the next year or two, but for the next, decades. And I think that's our mission. So I think it's small, incremental steps towards a world in which more and more of our lives looks like it is protected by the type of principles and the type of cryptographic property protections that Bitcoin provides.
I just want to add more to the incremental steps statement. So I don't think Bitcoin would overcome regulation in one big final battle necessarily, but it will be like a series of battles over many, many years. China bans Bitcoin mining. What do Bitcoin miners do? They distribute around the world. They become, more energy efficient and like stronger in a way. So one by one, like Bitcoin's going to face these battles. It'll build and innovate and overcome in, over years. So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah. Sorry.
Go ahead, Muneeb.
No, I was just going to plus on that, and also that I know that this has been a fascinating discussion, and we're running over a lot. I'm pretty sure Shannon might want to wrap up soon.
Yeah, we are about. It was too interesting. We're about a half an hour over. We might need to do a round 2 with this one. David, I know you've been holding off there for a little bit. Do you have a very quick question that we can kind of close with?
You guys have had such mind-blowing responses to some of these questions, and it's so cool to listen to everything, from the Chinese miners moving out to, surrounding countries, which is, just China spreading their economic reach. They're allowing their people to go mine out in Kazakhstan and other surrounding countries. So I think that's just a strategic move based on China. But you had mentioned, Muneeb, bringing mortgages to stacks earlier. And I didn't know if they had anything to do with here in the States. We had the second largest non-bank lender, United Wholesale Mortgage, announced that they're going to start taking Bitcoin. And are you working with anyone right now as far as bringing mortgages to the blockchain?
No, so I think my company Hiro is a developer tooling company, right? So we mostly work with developers who are trying to build interesting things, and we give them different libraries and tooling to do that. We effectively don't work in doing any partnerships to bring like these types of use cases there. We are mostly focused on developer tooling, but you brought up on mortgages, and I want to maybe use this as a almost like a closing statement here. That one really interesting property of a decentralized financial system, and in my view, that's going to happen around Bitcoin, is that at any given point in time, you know the total amount of risk in the system because it's so transparent. It's all smart contracts. You know what the collateral is. You know what the risk in the system is. And interestingly, this recently happened in the mortgages market when there was a huge dip that happened. And in the traditional financial system, like people freak out when that happens, right? So people are calling each other. They don't know how much risk is in the system. They don't know like who's going to go bust first. And I was actually sitting with some friends who work in that industry, and I was telling them I was not pitching Bitcoin DeFi to them as like this, crazy decentralized type of an idea. I was actually just talking to them and saying, what if I told you that, I can give you more visibility into the risk of the financial markets? You would have 100% visibility into what type of risk exists in the financial market. And they would like, yes, we absolutely want to know that. Like Wall Street wants that. Like they want to have visibility into the type of risk that exists in these financial markets, and which is exactly what decentralized finance is. And we have actually seen this recently with mortgages, and that just reminded me of it. But I feel like, imagine that the financial markets, hopefully around Bitcoin, because I feel like it's going to happen with or without Bitcoin, are going to be much, much better when you have more transparency and you have accurate risk calculations. I think that's the kind of thing that actually even people on Wall Street agree with you on, and they want that. And I think our responsibility is to make that future happen. Well, thank you so much for everyone for listening. I know we ran over for a long time. I'm seeing some really friendly faces in the audience right now.
Yeah.
Hey, Mike Friedman. I don't know if you can talk right now.
I invited him up to speak. Yeah, we've got quite a few questions in the queue. We need to do a second session. There's Mike. Hold on, is he signing on? Yeah, a second session is definitely going to be needed for sure. Let's see. Here we go. Hold on one second. One second. He's connecting.
For people who don't know, Mike Friedman is a professor at Princeton. I worked with him in the early days. He's been a co-author in a lot of the papers that came out of stacks and so on.
Nice to see this. I actually, embarrassingly, I came across this when I launched on Twitter. Otherwise, I would have listened to the whole thing. But I look forward to hearing it again.
Yeah, Mike, you're just catching the closing end of it. But I just wanted to say, I saw your face and I wanted to say hi.
Oh,
great. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Ingamar. Thanks, Edan. Yeah, another session is going to be needed. We're going to post this session also on Stack's YouTube channel as well. And Frankie, take it away.
yes. I think the crowd has said it already, right? Who else thought this was an authentic, highly engaging conversation about Bitcoin culture? Let's just take this time to give each of the speakers a fist pump to show them love, guys, for this refreshing perspective that they were bold enough to share with us today. There you go. Let me see it. I'm definitely listening to this conversation again. And if you want to too, search for Stacks on YouTube and the replay will be up within a day or two. And as exciting as this conversation has been, it must come to an end. But hey, join us next week, same time on Crypto Internet. Have a great night, everyone.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Yago.
Pleasure.